Welcome to Next Level Play Therapy, a weekly podcast dedicated to supporting the next generation of child and adolescent therapists to provide exceptional play therapy services. We'll explore all things play therapy to elevate your work with children and adolescents using the therapeutic powers of play. I'll discuss practical tips and ideas so you can provide a transformative experience for your young clients and make a real difference in their lives. So get ready to take your play therapy skills to the next level and make a lasting impact in the lives of children, adolescents, and families. Hey there, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Next Level Play Therapy, where I talk about all things play therapy and expressive arts. And this week, I am super excited for my guest today because I feel like there's an aspect in the play therapy arena that gets most of us kind of frustrated, overwhelmed, and tied in knots. And that is working with children from high conflict divorced family systems. And I think as play therapists, we want to help the child. And these are family systems that are so complex and challenging that I think oftentimes as a play therapy community, we kind of get lost. We're not sure what to do. And then we start making decisions that are maybe not always the most effective decisions. And that's why I am super excited about my guest today. So we can talk a little bit about some supports and some resources available to play therapists when you're working with this population. And so my guest today is Dr. Anne Ordway. I'm going to read from her bio because it is so impressive. I read it. I was like, oh, wow, that's so cool. And I feel like it's relevant because I feel like in the play therapy arena, if somebody doesn't have a mental health background and they only have a law background, we're like, you don't really know. But when we get someone who's got both, that to me is pure gold. And that is my guest today, Dr. Anne Ordway. She is the director of the Association for Family and Conciliation Courts, which is an international multidisciplinary professional organization dedicated to helping the resolution of family conflict. Anne is also a family law attorney. She practiced in New Jersey, where she focused on high conflict divorce and non-dissolution custody matters, domestic violence, and child protective services cases, all of which types of clients we experience in the play therapy arena. Anne also has her master's degree in clinical mental health counseling, and she has a PhD in counselor education and supervision. And as a lawyer-counselor hybrid, she's continued to work with families involved with conflict dynamics. She's facilitated anger groups for court populations due to family violence. She's been a mediator, child advocate, and parenting coordinator, and also a professor in a graduate level counselor education program for more than 12 years. And so I feel like Anne brings a wealth of information that I think is important for play therapists, because I remember 13 years ago, I was telling Anne this before we started. I remember 13 years ago, or back in 2013, might have been 13 years, maybe 11 years ago. Because if you've been doing play therapy for a while, you've probably had kids on your caseload from high conflict divorced families. And then what happens is we get lost, overwhelmed, confused, frustrated, and want to bang our head against the wall because we don't know what to do and nothing seems to be working. And parents just seem to be fighting and we're caught in the crossfires with the kids, right? And so what I usually do is I go to the research and I go down my rabbit hole, but I couldn't find anything. There was nothing about best practice, nothing until I stumbled across the Association for Family and Conciliation Courts and their guidelines for court-involved therapists. And that to me was like a lifeline. And so I use that as my best practice to guide me through when I'm doing supervision and consultation. When I'm doing trainings, I recommend it all the time. When I had a private practice, we set up front, we follow the guidelines set forth in the Association for Family and Conciliation Courts. These are the guidelines we use. And so that's why I was really excited to have Anne today. If you're joining us live, we'd love to know who's here. Post your name in the comments. Where are you from? What population do you work with? What questions do you have? The only thing that I would ask is, because this is a public forum, if you would not post any specific client questions, maybe more general questions, just due to privacy matters. And let's get started. So welcome, Anne. It is so awesome to have you. And I was thinking maybe you could talk a little bit about what is the Association for Family and Conciliation Courts.
Well, good morning, Cathi. And the first thing I want to say is thank you so much for inviting me to be with you this morning. The first thing that I want to just say is that I am the program director for AFCC. So what I do is I help to develop our programming and the training and the webinars and the conferences. And I work very closely with the executive director toward providing education. AFCC is a multidisciplinary international organization comprised primarily of court-involved family law professionals. So, in other words, our members are usually lawyers and judges and mediators, psychologists, social workers, licensed professional counselors. We have folks that work for the court services. We have folks that provide supervised parenting time or parenting coaching, and a whole host of other disciplines that get involved with the high conflict families that you are mentioning. And what AFCC does is a variety of things. For one, and I think one of our best features is that we provide networking and education. So we bring together some of the top professionals in the field, which certainly includes researchers who do the work in the trenches and study these families and techniques and interventions and what we need to know in order to do this work more effectively. And the other thing that we do is we offer live programming as well to give individuals an opportunity to network with each other so that the professions and the different roles can learn from each other and learn best practices. And we develop guidelines and practice sometimes standards, but mostly guidelines for how to do the work, depending on the different roles that people take on.
Yeah, I mean, that's for me, your guidelines for court-involved therapists. To me, if you're a play therapist and you have kids on your caseload, that's your best practice. That is following those guidelines. Like when I owned a group practice years ago, I said to people, we follow the guidelines set forth by AFCC because it's multidisciplinary.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Yeah, they were really good. And the trainings, I went to a training with the Utah chapter because I joined AFCC because I love it so much. I went to a training, it was one of the best trainings I've ever gone to on this topic. I was just so appreciative of the information and the work. And what was really helpful about it is it's that multidisciplinary
absolutely
approach. You know, you have attorneys, you have judges, you have psychologists, you have social workers, you have a variety of people. And these families are usually involved with all of these people.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's one of the things, like we were kind of talking earlier about the play therapy arena. Like I've been in the mental health field for 30 years now. I've always worked with children, adolescents, and families. And over the last 15, I've kind of done a lot more training, consulting in my Play Therapy Academy. In fact, we have Steph today who's in Play Therapy Academy, timely because my records just got subpoenaed in a high conflict. And that's like the worst fear for play therapists. Like we all dread, that's like our worst fear. And we, our stomach gets tied up in knots and we want to go throw up somewhere because we imagine all these horrible things. And it's really not as bad as we envision it if we know how to navigate it.
That's exactly the key. It's about knowing how to navigate, and it's about being prepared. If you know your case and you understand the guidelines, you're going to be safer in the overall practice, and your work is going to be effective when you share it with the court and the court-involved professionals.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the other things is how. Like what, we talk about different lanes. I say this all the time, like, what's my lane? And when I do a lot of supervision, I talk about like, what's your lane? When I owned a group practice, I would say to the therapists that worked for me, like, what's your lane? Don't go out of your lane. These are challenging families. Make sure you're clear about what your lane is, because
Absolutely.
Yeah, because what we get asked to do by well-meaning court professionals, because they don't know. They look to the play therapist as the expert. So they want us to give custody and visitation recommendations. They want us to, I heard one play therapist say, I'm going to go and advocate for my client. I'm going to testify in court and I'm going to advocate for them. And I was like, oh, no, that's a bad idea. Bad idea. Not your lane, not your lane. And I think AFCC provides a lot of resources
absolutely,
so that play therapists can stay in their lane and refer to people whose lane it is. But I don't think play therapists know what's available. Like, what's a custody evaluator? What's a parenting coordinator? What do they do? And how is that different than the therapist?
So what you said kind of presented a lot of loaded questions.
Right.
So I'm going to try and cover all of that. AFCC provides a variety of resources, including the court-involved therapists' guidelines, which really talks a lot about what the involvement of the individual therapist is and what the source of that involvement is. Are they individually selected by a family before court involvement, where they're working, for example, with a child for a different purpose, and then the family becomes court involved? Are they appointed by the court specifically, where a judge enters an order that specifically mentions you by name and directs that you will provide therapy for the child or another family member? Or does the court enter an order that says that that there's a requirement for therapy in the family, but then the family selects you as an individual? At AFCC, in addition to the guidelines that we offer, we have guidelines on a variety of topics, including parenting coordination, which you mentioned earlier. We just recently have new guidelines that came out within, I'm going to say, about a year and a half ago for parenting plan evaluators, which is another role that you mentioned. We also have a journal that we publish quarterly, which is the Family Court Review, which is it's thick, and it's one of the most recognized journals for this field internationally as well as nationally. And we have a newsletter that offers short, pithy articles that are easy to read, that give tips and practice suggestions for different roles. We have obviously the networking. We do 3 comprehensive trainings a year, including one on parenting coordination and one on parenting plan evaluations. That's very involved for people that are interested in becoming evaluators. We have a monthly webinar on a variety of topics. And we also have a quarterly DE&I webinar series where we focus more on multicultural issues. When you talk about differences in roles, a custody evaluator, also known as a parenting plan evaluator, and we're change that terminology because custody sounds like such a harsh word, much more possessory, whereas we're trying to recognize that it's more about parenting planning regarding children and the time that they spend with their parents. A parenting plan evaluator is someone who is selected, court appointed, to come in and meet with all of the family members. Sometimes, depending on their discipline, they might do testing, but they do a lot of clinical observation and interaction. And ultimately, they are expected to render a report that includes information that a court will consider for ultimate parenting plan determinations. In some places, we're going to call those recommendations, but it's really important for everybody to be familiar with the nuances of their own jurisdiction, because what you're going to do in Nevada is going to be very different than what a professional is going to do in Utah or in New Jersey or, in Minnesota. So knowing what the rules are and what the guidelines are in your individual location, really critical. You mentioned parenting coordinators. A parenting coordinator is someone that is can be selected, but usually appointed by the court. And what that person does is they help to manage the conflict, and they facilitate communication between the parents in an effort to take the children out of the middle. And for the goal of not having the children become little messengers and not having the children absorb the conflict. And so a parenting coordinator in some jurisdictions can make recommendations to the parents for how to resolve the conflict. In some locations, their recommendations can be binding. In other cases, they are just suggestions. And ultimately, in some places, they can be implemented to become orders of the court. So it's, again, very jurisdictionally sensitive, but the parenting coordinator is really outside of court to try to help people avoid having to go into court and file applications over every single issue. The parenting coordinator is also, in most places, not confidential. So unlike a therapist, a parenting coordinator in many places is able to report back on what happens in the process, and sometimes even to give the court some insight regarding what's breaking down in the communication between the parents. Lastly, you asked about the therapist, and therapists can have different roles. A therapist can be appointed for a specific purpose. So I'm going to have, a court order that says that I'm supposed to work with a particular family member as a therapist, and that family member needs support. Maybe it's a child that is not doing well because of the parents' divorce and who's getting caught up in the conflict. Maybe it is a parent who has anger management issues or substance abuse issues. I find that the courts are more likely to refer to a play therapist for children, primarily because I don't know that courts or judges in all jurisdictions understand that play therapy has an application for adults and older family members as well. So that's, part of education. If a therapist is court appointed, there is usually an understanding that that person will be asked for some kind of a report to the court. And it can be defined as simple as an outline of cooperation, prognosis, treatment planning, or it can be more comprehensive where the court really wants to know how the individual in therapy is doing. If the play therapist, or mainstream therapist is not court appointed and they are selected by the family, they can still be subpoenaed. And I like Steph's comment, because, just because you're not court involved from the get-go doesn't mean that you are in a safe role and that you're not going to be subpoenaed. A subpoena is a long arm of the court, usually in most jurisdictions issued by the attorney. It's not a letter. It is on a formal document, and it can ask you to produce records. It can ask you to come and testify. It can ask you to do both. And when you get a subpoena, the most important thing to remember is don't ignore it. Don't ignore it. Really helpful to think about consulting with an attorney in your jurisdiction to understand what your obligations are and what you're going to be turning over. If it asks for your whole file, you can't pick and choose what you're going to give and what you're not going to give. I've been in cases where play therapists have been subpoenaed and actually asked to bring in the props that a child has worked with,
Wow.
right? And then asked to interpret what the props stand for. And that is a slippery slope, as you know, because play therapists are about observing and facilitating the individual's interpretation, not ascribing their own interpretation. So, yeah, you can have lots of different roles. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. And I think for me, one of the things I think it's important for play therapists to understand is these professionals are available.
Mm-hmm.
So we get asked as play therapists, I can't tell you how many times I was asked by attorneys or CPS workers, because oftentimes these high conflict families have CPS involved. They have, possibly some family history of addiction. These are usually the higher acuity families if they're super, super entrenched in the conflict. So they have complicated histories. And oftentimes as play therapists, I can't tell you how many times I've been asked to make a recommendation about visitation. And in some points, even kind of, and with good intention, like I get where attorneys are coming from. They're hoping, and judges are hoping, mental health professionals can help them make sense of something that doesn't make sense. And what I think it's important for play therapists to understand is our role is to support the child through this complicated minefield that they're having to navigate. There are other professionals who are specifically trained to look at parenting plans and look at visitation. And like you were saying, these, to me, those parenting coordinators sound like worth their weight in gold. If there's somebody who can come in and specifically work with the parents to help them get to a more collaborative place, then that takes the play therapist out of that role of trying to walk through this minefield, because it's the makings of burnout.
Sure. The more we're involved in these tug-of-war processes, we absolutely can be burned out. And, I love what you said, because, really most professionals are well-meaning, not all, but most.
True.
Most. Some have an agenda, and it does happen sometimes where an attorney recommends that an individual go and see a therapist for the purpose of later using that therapist to testify or advocate on behalf of that individual. individual. So sometimes there's an agenda and it's, predetermined, and it's about setting it up. But most often, that's not the case. And the attorney is really looking for information to educate the judge and to give the judge more information about the family. I mean, if you think about it, the court process is a stranger in a black robe. And and I say this with absolute respect for the system, because I worked as an attorney in the system for a long time. It's somewhat like a conveyor belt. People are given a docket number, and then it becomes a get them in, get them out mentality. And the judges are accountable to the administrative office that governs them in their state. And so they have to resolve a certain number of cases every year and bring those cases to conclusion. And they have to ultimately help the families, but they don't have a lot of time to complete it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They don't have time to really get to know the families. They don't, they get a snapshot. They get the snapshot that the lawyer can provide. And unfortunately, is that really enough? So they rely on the mental health professionals to testify, to give them insight. And you then only have so much time to be able to do that. And then people's lives are impacted by the final order. And, you're often talking about good people, nice people who are in a terrible crisis time in their lives.
Right. Yes.
Sometimes they're acting reactively, not because they're bad people, but because they are overwhelmed with what's happening, and they're dealing with issues that affect the most important thing in their life, which is their children.
Yeah, they're scared. Definitely scared. Yeah. And I'm always an advocate. Like, I tell people that I supervise and oversee their work, and also people I consult with. If you're in play therapy, you have to have some kind of a structure in place for families that like these that are going to come across. You need to communicate up front what your role is, but you can't communicate that if you don't really know what your role is. Like, in the mental health field, I've heard people say things about being an advocate, and I'm like, you got to be real careful what you're like. Yes, that's part of our ethics is advocacy. And the associations we belong to have their ideology, right? And so somehow in there, we have to navigate what that looks like in real life. And when I heard a play therapist say, well, I'm going to get on the court and I'm going to advocate I'm going to get on the stand. I'm going to be a witness. I'm going to advocate for my client. And my thought was, no, that's not your role. Your role on the stand is witness, facts. Like, if you're there as an expert witness, then that's based on your experience, expertise, and training. So you may be called to give expert testimony, but you have to understand, if you haven't had a lot of contact with both sides of the family, there's a good likelihood you got sucked into the dynamics. And if you're a family therapist, this is like, we all know this. Like, it's not if you get sucked into family dynamics, it's when and how often and how do you get out?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you're right to distinguish between the fact witness and the expert witness, because the expert witness is brought in for a purpose, and they're either evaluating and giving recommendations, or they're providing education. So an expert, you could be brought in to testify, to explain to the court what play therapy is, what the ethics are, and what the play therapist in the case should and should not have done. And sometimes that happens when one side is questioning what the play therapist who is involved in the case has actually done and what they testified about. So that can happen. As a fact witness, what you're really testifying to is things like, does the client appear for their scheduled appointments? Are they on time? What are your observations? Are the parents fighting out in the waiting room? Does, one parent bring the child more often than the other parent? Is one parent just completely out of the process because they are choosing not to be? Sometimes you can be asked about what someone has said to you. You might be asked about what a child has commented while they're doing Santray, or while they're doing some kind of a play interaction. You might be asked about what a parent has said to you when they bring the child or when they're leaving with the child, and that is fact.
Right.
Sometimes an attorney will say to you, well, you've been working with this child for over a year now, and you testified that during Santray, the child selected a princess figure and said, well, that's me. And then they put a castle next to themselves, and then they picked a really huge troll. And when you asked, who is this troll, the child said, well, that's my dad. And the attorney says to you, well, what does that mean? Well, if the child hasn't told you what that means to them, then, you really shouldn't comment on it.
Because that's not factual.
It's not factual. And, the attorney might be looking, especially if it's the attorney for mom, and there are allegations against dad, the attorney might be looking for you to say, oh, well, the troll is an evil creature, and, it means that the child's afraid. Well, it might just be that the child's really into the troll movie that just came out.
Right. Or mad at dad.
Or mad at dad in the moment.
Or heard terrible things from mom about dad and is trying to sort it out. So many different things it could be. Yeah.
So we really have to always, especially like I know with the play therapy guidelines, it's really important to know what you can and cannot do in terms of interpretation and what you're recording and how you're deriving opinions or thoughts for case conceptualization and recommendations that are treatment based.
Right.
That's different than being an evaluator and actually getting underneath those interpretations.
Well, and the thing I think it's important for a play therapist to understand about the different professionals that work with these families is like the parenting plan evaluator. That person is going to go to both homes, going to talk to both parents, going to really get into the day-to-day to have a better sense. As play therapists, we see that child one time a week, maybe for an hour. And we might have 75,000 phone calls in between, which is never helpful. And we don't know. We don't know. And there are people whose job it is to know. And even the parenting coordinator, that tapping into these other resources and being part of that group of professionals supporting the family through a really difficult time in their life. If we see ourselves more as, this is my lane, I'm going to stay in my lane. This is what my lane says, which is why I love those AFCC guidelines for court-involved therapists, because it helped me know what's my lane. How do I navigate my lane? How do I stay in my lane? And I don't want to get out of my lane. And then how do I connect with these other professionals so when things come up, then I have resources to give parents to get more support so that I don't have to get out of my lane.
So the experts in the case, the other professionals, whether it's a parenting coordinator or an evaluator, if you're working with a family member, those individuals may reach out to you, and you will want a release of information. You will want something signed that allows you to speak to them and them to you. And they're going to ask you about your interaction with the family member. If you're in court, sometimes even when you try to stay in your lane, you're going to have an attorney who will say, well, you've been working with this child for over a year. Surely you have an opinion regarding who should have primary custody of the child or what the parenting plan should be. And my answer to that is, of course, you have an opinion. You're a human being, but that doesn't mean you need to share it. And you can advocate for your client without crossing that line. And so advocacy in the context of a fact witness or a court-involved therapist is really about making the child, for example, feel supported and be supported. And that can be, providing information to the court. Children who are caught in high conflict dynamics between their parents are impacted in this way and that way and the other way. I am concerned that because my client, the child, is telling me that mom and dad fight a lot, that's really hard on this child. And so what do I mean when I advocate? I mean, tell them to knock it off. I mean, suggest that they get therapy so that they are maybe taught how to better manage their own feelings and how they manifest those feelings, so this child isn't triangulated.
Right. And advocacy is, hey, there are parenting coordinators.
Right. Absolutely.
Hey, there's an app that you can probably talk to your attorney about to see if that will help with the communication between you.
Absolutely.
That's advocacy. And I've that happens a lot. And the one attorney will want you to testify. And I look at them and say, well, that you've called me here as a fact witness. That requires expert. That's not fact.
That's true. You have to, and I think it's important to not be goaded into saying something that's out. So you have to really listen to the question. Yeah. And you have to think before you speak. And, Cathi, you are an expert and you are a highly credentialed individual that is very well respected in your field. That doesn't mean that you are being called into court as an expert in custody, evaluation, and recommendations for that particular case. So sometimes in order to try to get you to give more information or to go outside of your lane, you might be questioned in a way that suggests that you are under credentialed or your credentials are not good enough.
Right.
And it's important to be true to yourself, and it's important to know what your credentials are and to be familiar with the literature in the field and to be able to explain what you know and what you have done to get where you are. That doesn't mean you have to then give an opinion on custody.
Absolutely. In fact, sometimes, we have to use wisdom, right? We have to know. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the resources of AFCC as we kind of wrap up. I would highly recommend, if you're a play therapist, I would highly recommend investing in joining AFCC because I think they have a lot of good resources. I would say go over to the AFCC website, which we will also post that in the comments. The website is afccnet.org.
It's www.afccnet.org.
Yeah.
And I am the program director, and my email is available on that website. Anybody should feel free to reach out to me. I am happy to guide you. I think, and I mean, we have a lot of resources at AFCC, and, as you mentioned, I practiced law for a long time. I'm a retired attorney from New Jersey, and I did clinical work, and I've also worked as a professor, and I don't do any of those things since I have become full-time staff at AFCC. I personally feel that our members are our greatest resource, and we have access to some of the top people in the world who work with court-involved families in family court. Some of the resources that I'm going to mention, I mean, Lynn Greenberg, who's in California, is a court-involved, excuse me, a court-involved therapist, and she was the reporter for the original guidelines for court-involved therapy. And she does a lot of webinars and trainings related to this topic, some of which are available on our website. Another huge resource that one of our members is Mindy Mitnick, who is a psychologist from Minnesota. And Mindy has a tremendous background in working with children, interviewing children, and she's also done a lot of webinars and trainings for us. So those resources are also available. I mentioned that we have the Family Court Review, which is more scholarly and comprehensive, and articles on a variety of topics. And we do special issues too. So, for example, coming up, we have an issue that is really devoted to cultural issues with family. Coming up, I think I want to say next year, there is a whole issue that's going to be devoted to older family members and the roles that older family members might play in family court.
Oh, that's a really good point.
So really good focused and general issues. The e-news, of which I am proud to be the editor, is published monthly, and we send it to all of our members as well as non-members who want to be on the list. And there are usually articles that are substantive on specific topics. So we've had some perspective articles on parent-child contact problems, which is a big issue. We have had 10 tips where we take a specific practice area. Ken Perlmutter and Christy Bradshaw Schmidt from Ken's from California, Christy's from Texas. They did an article on brief focused assessments. And there's tips like, what do you need to know? What do you need to do when you're dealing with that particular topic? So those are very useful and very helpful for members, and they're easy reads. We also have the monthly webinars, which are on a variety of topics, but the very best thing is that if you're a, if you're a member, you can access the webinars on our archives under resources. So you could go in and you could look at the different webinars that we've offered over the years. And if you want to, for example, listen to Mindy Mitnick's webinar from a couple of years ago, I think 2 years ago, on child sexual abuse. If you want to listen to Lynn Greenberg's webinar on court-involved therapy, you can access those as a member. In addition to that, we have the DE&I webinars, which are focused on cultural issues. We just recently did one on military as a culture and families who are military connected. We have one coming up that is going to focus on African American parenting and discipline by two experts who have also done trainings. We have conferences. We usually run 2 conferences a year, but every other year we partner with the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers for an additional conference. But usually we have the fall conference and the child custody symposium, which alternate. So this coming fall in November, we have the 16th Child Custody Symposium, where we focus primarily on parenting plan issues and parenting and issues that relate to children. This year, we're doing a big focus on assessment. We do, in alternating years, a more generalized conference. That's a fall conference, and that's usually held somewhere around November. And lately, we've been doing that as a virtual conference to accommodate people who can't come in person. So I don't know whether that's going to continue or not, but it's an option. We have an annual conference every year, And this coming year, it's in Boston. Next year, it's in New Orleans. And again, we have pre-conference institutes, which are intensive all-day learning opportunities. We have plenary and keynote sessions. We, at the annual, usually have 80 workshops for people to choose from, right? So 80 workshops. So you're going to find something that interests you and that is in line with what you want to learn. Opportunities to network with some of the top people in the world. We get people who come in from Japan, Australia, New Zealand, certainly many friends in Canada, where we have 3 chapters. We have 23 chapters worldwide. 3 of them are in Canada. And we always have new chapters emerging, so that's really exciting. But you can join the parent organization. And then for people that have a chapter in their area, we recommend that as well. You mentioned attending a conference at the Utah chapter. That's amazing when you have that opportunity to go to a local conference and focus more on the nuances for the region or the jurisdiction in which you live. We also do the 3 comprehensive trainings. We have parenting coordination. It's fundamentals to train a parenting coordinator. That's in December. Then we have in January, we run an advanced training. This coming year, it will be focused on parent-child contact problems. And we do an intensive, about a week and a half long, parenting plan evaluators training. So lots of opportunities, lots of networking, lots of resources, including the guidelines on the website. Long before I worked for AFCC, I considered AFCC to be one of the most valuable resources I accessed as a professional, and the place where I would get a lot of bang for the buck. So,
absolutely,
and I belong to ACA and APA and ABA. Which is the American Bar Association. So, I touch all of those. AFCC brings it all together. Yep. And really, it teaches us how to be multilingual as well, because we learn each other's language as we do this work in a way that's really going to help families, because that's what it's all about. We all want to help the families we're working with. We want to make the court system a better place, hopefully.
Yes, absolutely. So if people are interested in learning more about AFCC, I put the website in the comments. And there was a Facebook user asked about the cost of membership. That'll be on the website. Just a little tip, one of the things, because there's so much on the website, I found if I do a search on the website, I can usually find what I'm looking for. Thank you, Anne, so much for being a guest and kind of helping those of us in the play therapy arena better understand some things that often feel overwhelming, frustrating, confusing, and quite frankly, scary. And I think it's important for play therapists to be aware, be informed, and know what your resources are. And I think AFCC is a really good resource for play therapists.
You are also a tremendous resource, Cathi, and I personally enjoy your lives and your podcasts, and I appreciate all that you do to help professionals in the field be at their very best. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so that wraps up today's episode, and I will see you guys next week. Bye for now. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Next Level Play Therapy. I hope you found the discussion valuable and gained new insights and ideas to support your work helping children, adolescents, and families heal. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. Your feedback helps to improve and reach more people who can benefit from this information. Remember, play therapy is a powerful tool for healing and growth. Whether you're a new play therapist or experienced, I encourage you to continue your learning journey to unlock the potential of play in your own work and relationships. If you have any questions or topic suggestions for future episodes, I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on social media and visit my website at Renewing Hearts Play Therapy Training to stay updated on upcoming episodes, trainings, and resources. Thank you once again for listening to Next Level Play Therapy. Until next time, keep playing, learning, and growing.